Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining in so early on the weekend. And I would like to take forward with my PPT today, which is titled as Procurement Tools. So, first of all, I would like to check if everybody is okay and doing well, considering this pandemic hasn't got over. And I hope everybody is in best of their health and spirits, and also their family. Now, just to give a background about why I chose this topic. So when I say procurement tools, so it may seem a bit ambiguous when we talk about procurement tools. It's all about Ariba, SAP, or Coupa, Evalua, SharePoint, etc. But I'm going to talk about a bit of intangible, informative tools that we utilize in day-to-day life, which do not require any kind of technology as such, but require more of intellect, not on a high level, but at least something that drives a decision making. And the idea for this PPT came in when I was conducting my previous webinar for negotiation, and I had a slide for one of the procurement tools, and which had a question raised by one of the participant that what it is, and I thought that it's a good way to brush up some basics. So this presentation would be more on the basic side, so it would be a good insightful presentation for the people who are early in their careers, or who are looking for some consolidated version of information. It would be a good refreshers for veterans in this sourcing and procurement domain. So I would definitely look forward to their feedback as well, and also the people who would find this as new. And for some of us, it would be a good refresher and something to look back to. So without further ado, I'll start with my presentation. Give me a second. Sorry, I think I'm. So, sorry, I had some glitch at my end. So, just for introduction, my name is Deepak Kumar Mehto. I am closing in on a decade of experience for supply chain domain. I am a mechanical engineer. I've done postgraduate diploma in international trade from Symbiosis, and I'm a CPSM. I've verified CPSM in 2015 and then again in 2018. I've done a project management certification as well for Prince 2 Agile. And as a hobbies, I love teaching. I'm more of a student. I love sharing, so I won't say teaching, but it's more of something that I picked up from my college days. Then hobbies, love outdoor sports. I love to play cricket. I'm a part of local club cricket team here. And below is the email ID where you can reach out to me and we can have furthermore discussion on sourcing and procurement domain. So that's it, a very quick introduction for myself. So agenda for the today, as I said, I would be talking about some of the major procurement tools and where they can be used and where I have used them, and some use case scenario. The perspective is to see a pragmatic use, because when we go through theoretical use, our theoretical knowledge of things, then we are not able to visualize where we would be able to use it and how we would be able to drive value out of them. A quick caution to everyone that this would be an indicative list, not an exhaustive list on its own. So I know there are hundreds of tools out, but I have picked up what I use the most and which I have been using throughout my last 10 years. Now, the dictionary meaning of tool is a device which basically is handy and is actually used to carry out a particular function. It can be a hammer, it can be a lever, and it can be anything. But when it comes to procurement, it's all about intangible information driven tools, which enables and define enhances efficiency. Because if we are looking at a sourcing and procurement professional, A sourcing and procurement professional epitomizes multitasking. We are somebody in the organization who keeps on working on different and variety of projects at the same point in time, which includes strategic job of handling a project, which include a transactional job of handling a transaction, how a purchase order would be done, which may include a delivery follow-up, which may include cross-functional coordination as well. So there are a lot of things, and such tools will obviously will make life easier and make our job more efficient and make enhance our efficiency as well. So just a quick reminder, this is just a source to contract cycle and everybody is aware of it. And so just for a quick reminder, it starts with need assessment and goes to market research. When we are need assessment, when we are trying to understand what the item is required, what is the goods and service we're looking at, whether we are able to in-sources or outsources, whether buying a certain set of features is required or not. Moving on to that, then we move to market research. We understand what is the supplier scenario, whether it's a buyer's market, whether it's a seller's market, whether there are a lot of suppliers available in the local market, whether we need to go for international sourcing, all that stuff. Then we do supplier selection. We choose suppliers which we deem fit for. We try to run a bit of, I have said RFX in the upcoming slide, but we try to understand with whom we would like to run our RFX or RFIs start initially, and then moving on to RFPs and RFQs, maybe reverse auction later if it is a very standard or off the shelf item, or we are able to standardize our requirement with suppliers first. Then the next part is contracting. Contracting would cover a lot of discussion around the terms of purchases and also the legality of purchase, not just the pricing point. Then what kind of contract has to be done, whether it has to be a fixed price arrangement or a time and material arrangement, or else it would be a definite kind of a contract or a value-based contract. So all that stuff is driven here. Post contract, there is contract performance management where we see contract compliance, where we see whether the supplier is delivering as per what the contract was done, whether the resources that were uh, uh, aligned to certain level of qualification are delivering what they were asked to deliver. So all that stuff is there. And last time I mentioned as supplier relationship management, or more of understanding how to maintain that relationship with suppliers. So keeping an open and honest feedback kind of sessions with supplier where we delve out the details, where what has gone right and what has gone wrong, where there can be a scope of improvement, whether there has been a shift or change in the financials of the supplier, whether there is need of a compliance to an upcoming legislative requirement or upcoming data protection requirement or upcoming political requirement or tax requirement. So that kind of a thing can be covered. And it keeps on, it's in constant cycle and it keeps on moving in a year and year or periodic kind of time of purchase. So this was just a quick refresher of the social contract cycle. Now, moving on to my first tool that I would say is Stakeholder Map. When I mention a Stakeholder Map is because I would like to understand whenever I am given a project, whenever I'm given a goods or services to source, or whenever I'm asked to look into any kind of specific requirement, I would like to understand who would be the parties I would be dealing with and who would be the party that I would require to keep close coordination with and get the appropriate amount of information or maybe approvals, and I would have to keep them informed. So rather than doing a big elaborate stakeholder map where I list out people's name, their functions, their associated actions, we just keep it to a very simple and like to understand what people would be falling into or the four quadrants which are made here. So the quadrants are on the x-axis, it is the interest of the person in the project, and the on the y-axis is the power or the influence that a person can have on the project. And basis that if somebody has the highest power and low interest, then we need to keep that person satisfied. We need to have their needs in check. And somebody who has highest power and highest influence on the project, we have to manage closely. And similarly, if on a lower level of power and the effect of their influence is minimum, then we need to be having a monitor kind of a state, or just need to have minimum effort regarding them. So just a quick example would be to keep informed would be our managers. I mean, this would be definitely when they are not directly involved in it, just they want to be aware of what the status of project is, so that they are not being escalated to by the stakeholders or by the other influencing parties. For keeping satisfied, we can talk about finance, legal, where we are able to have discussion with them, keep them aware that we are working in within the given guidelines. And to manage closely, I would say that it would be the stakeholders that we are working with who define the requirement, who make changes to it. I mean, it can be a product manager, it can be a manufacturing manager, which will have the highest interest and highest influence power. So moving on to the next one. So specification template. So just to broaden out what specification template is, I've been when I started my career, I saw a piece of Excel sheet where it's clearly defined all the aspect of what the item was supposed to be purchased. Now, when we talk about need assessment, we would like to understand as a sourcing and procurement a professional, we would like to understand the goods and services in black and white, and and more parameters should be given in the initial stages so that the correct sourcing or the right sourcing can take place. So we used to have a simple Excel sheet which used to define the uh, goods and services, what was the purpose of that goods and services, what were the key features of it. So for example, if you were buying a welding machine, so what was the usage of that welding machine over a 10 minute cycle, or when we were buying when we were buying in software, what was the type of license, whether it is a concurrent or or a flexible or a fixed node. So that kind of requirement was there, and what all modules were covered in if we are buying, say for example, an enterprise plan for software. So that kind of features are required. If they are present there, then it becomes really easy to initiate a discussion with the supplier, reaching out to them, or it also clarifies the sourcing and procurement professional to understand how and what is being purchased. It understand helps them to understand the tangibleness of the nature of the project. Then when we talk about testing and acceptance criteria, now it is good practice to understand what is the testing and the acceptance criteria of the things or goods being bought in or services being taken. So for example, when we buy a capex machinery, or we buy say in a capex machinery, when we are buying a drilling machine, so we are looking to understand whether what thickness of material would be minimum or maximum would be required, and how that finish would be worked up. So both, if we can have testing criteria at both at suppliers and at both at our end as well after the installation and commissioning of the machine. So if we mention it clearly beforehand, we are able to also convey a message to supplier that we are aware of what the product is, and we would not be buying it just basis their brochure. Then required warranty and spare and maintenance. Now it depends on how we want to work with. If we are a completely greenfield project, we tend to look for products with everything attached to it, at least so that we are covered for coming next 2 or 3 years. We had a practice where we asked for a maintenance engineer to be available in say 2 days at a site when if required, and that was the requirement we conveyed to the supplier. So it forced the supplier to have uh, or we selected only those suppliers who had the service capabilities only, rather than buying the machine on its technicality and set out parameters or the features. So these specification is pretty standard, are available. It could be used, and we can give it to stakeholders when they are coming up with their requirement that we are looking for X item, and they can we can tell them this is a specification template, and I would like you to fill it as much as you can, so that it gives me a good outline of what you're looking at, and it helps them to think about aspects that they haven't thought about it. So it's a very easier template, and it helps really well in when you are starting a project. Now, this is spend analysis. I've mentioned it as one of the tool, but it is really the biggest standard look point in any buyer or any data analyst or spend analyst if in your team. And it is important that not just the one person who's handling the MIS function should know it, but everybody should be able to, as a buyer, you should be able to analyze data at least on some level, so that you can derive some metrics which are required for discussion. You can understand the spend profile much better. I mean, going into, it's not about having capabilities of big data or capabilities of, say, for example, or data scientist, but a normal analysis of being able to do HLOOKUP, VLOOKUP, and pivoting the data and understanding the basic metrics, that will be really helpful. So when we talk about spend analysis, we have two sources of data. One is the purchase order data, and other is the invoicing data. We definitely, when we look at, we think about purchase order data, which is the committed spend, and which may or may not have happened, or which may or may not have paid out. But the invoicing data is the true data that we assume, and it is a really good to understand what is the actual outflow of cash. And it also helps to understand that how are the are whether we are facing any invoicing issues, because that impacts a lot of suppliers, because you could see that there are times when the upstream functions, which is source to contract function, works really well with supplier to get the discounts done in the initial contracting phase. But when it comes to the contract compliance stage, when the contract is being utilized, there are times when the supplier do not get the payment. It may be because of the fact that the users are not doing the confirmation in the system, or the SAP, or whatever the ERP where we are using, and basis which AP is not able to pay out the invoices on time, or maybe the financial records are not in place. So this kind of thing helps there as well. We are able to understand the size of the problem, what is the exact amount being paid after what payment terms in actuality, rather than what we are saying on the purchase order. So when I move to what is the requirement, obviously spend analysis requires some set of data, and a higher the set, the better it is. But it requires a lot of cleansing, because cleansing means to remove unnecessary data items, or to rationalize things. So, for example, you might have one supplier which would be registered with different entity names. So when you will try to rationalize it, you will keep it under one name, so it will keep easier. So for example, there would be a spend in different currencies. So a good practice would be to convert those spend into a single base currency to understand what is the value of spend. And a good tip would be to use and foreign exchange rate, which is given by finance. And at least this is something that I've got to know, that the exchange rate should be up to 4 decimals, so it helps you to get the real picture. Now, what metrics that can we derive is that we can understand the spend by category, by supplier, by material, and it obviously depends on how the data is available with you, whether each line has the bifurcation in the PO with respect to what the short text or description was for purchase order, what is the material category that was aligned to this spend. And then there is a comparison of year on year spend that you can get and understand with respect to what supplier is doing. One of the key aspects that you can get from spend analysis is that you can understand what is the supplier spend, and if you have some information on what their revenue is, you'll be able to understand how much amount of money your organization is contributing to their own revenue. So that will give you a quite a strengthening point or leverage when you're negotiating with them later, or maybe in upcoming cycles. And it also helps in doing internal benchmarking. So a lot of times, a lot of organizations or a lot of buyers do not have access to tools like Gartner or Hackett or Casme, so they do not get the information of standard roles and materials outside. But internal benchmarking can be done by the available spend data you have. If the spend data is cleansed and rationalized properly, you can understand what is the, so for example, if you're having a technical engineer or a solution architect in your organization, which is being employed by a lot of different IT suppliers. So you can filter out and understand what is the spend being paid, what is the average or the median being paid for a solution architect, and that can be utilized. You could simply do a quartile analysis where you can understand what all spends are in upper quartile and lower quartile, and understand the median and the average rates being paid. So it helps in doing the internal benchmarking and helps to understand what we are paying for specific roles. But this is a very long topic point, and it can consume its own 1 hour. Now, I mentioned Pareto as separate, but it's normally every time that it is part of our spend analysis, and it's the most used tool that a purchasing person uses. So it says, and somebody people also know it as ABC analysis, ABC classification as well. So we are trying to understand that the major problems are because of the least number of reasons, and it says that 80% of your problems stem or are derived because of 20% of reasons. So it's a very simple tool, and it asks you to have accumulative values in ascending order, sorry, descending order. And when you are able to look at a data, you'll understand that the 80% of situation, if you can fix those, you would only need to work on the 20% of reasons. So here I've given a simple example where it isn't just relying on the spend. It can be anything. It can be the quality defects, it can be problems, it can be anything that is measurable, anything that is you can have observation. So on the left hand side you see that there are measurable items which are just denoted as the alphabets, and they are measurements that we have done. And when I make this into descending order, and when I do the cumulative sum and I try to find understand, then I see that only CAD contributes to a total of 84% of the measurements rather than the others. So there are 11 items, 11 rows in this, but only three are contributing more than 80%. So if we fix these three first, or because these become our first priority, then that is the easiest way to solve or to start a problem, rather than I say solve the complete problem. And if you want to do an ABC classification from this, then it can be that your A would be up to 80%. Then if we can say from say till 99% can be your B, and from below that can be your C. It can vary. Obviously, if there are large number of line items, then it would be up to 80% A, up to 90% B, and from 90 to 100 C. So Pareto or ABC classification, people call it with their own name, but I've given it as a separate slide from trend analysis because it can be used in multiple situations, irrespective, and it helps as a really good starting point and a quick starting point. Now, when we talk about when we do after understanding the need analysis part, and we understand the spend, we talk about understanding spend. And when we are able to derive spend analysis, we are able to see that there would be few suppliers for specific categories, and few suppliers, very few suppliers for certain categories. And then we try to understand what our strategy of engagement would be with those suppliers. So on basis the two parameters, that is the availability of supply. So supply risk is where we have what number of suppliers are available, whether those suppliers are, whether they are least number of suppliers, whether we have to do international sourcing. So availability of supply risk is on the x-axis, and the profit impact or the amount of spend that you do is on the y-axis. So anything where you see there is least of suppliers, there are many suppliers available in the market, and the spend is also low. So that becomes the non-critical item, and it just needs product standardization. So we just try to move from uh, custom specifications to standard specifications, so that we can utilize the available suppliers, so they can the switching cost from one supplier to the other supplier becomes very low. And because of availability of more supply in the market, it becomes supplier's market, and it gives you leverage to do a lot of. I mean, you can create catalogs, you can create, you are able to e-tender, you can do reverse auction as well for these items if you want, because the suppliers are more and they are looking for business. Similarly, when the spend is high and the supplier risk is low, and then we call it as leverage items. Now we understand that we are able to spend a lot, and there are many suppliers, so it keeps giving us the ability to use our buyer power. We can use our purchasing power to have a discussion with suppliers, because if there are a lot of suppliers available, they would be looking for business, and we can keep the incumbent on its toes rather than him being or her being complacent. We can go to them and say and keep a constant check. We can have reductions easily with there, and if not reduction, we can have improvements, because the supplier would buy to maintain its business, and the availability of supply keeps less risk, and allows us to work properly and uh, prioritize on the items which are next. So when we have the spend which is low and there is the supply risk which is high, then we talk about bottleneck items, which are very low spend items but are very niche to certain suppliers, and only we can buy from them. So the rule is that there is a scarcity of supplier, and we do not you do not want to run into a situation where you have a issue with them, either the supplier. So one of the things that we can look into is we can try to innovate, we can try to create an alternative. Then the responsibility lies internally a lot, so that we do not run into a risk of supply continuity risk. So we want our internal teams to look into the bottleneck items, to bring them into non-critical items, so that we do not have a situation where it impacts our production or productivity later down the line. So, but yes, the biggest liability for a S&P professional in bottleneck item is to maintain the supply, rather than focusing on the pricing at that point in time. The bigger priority is to maintain the supply. Then it comes the most critical piece is the strategic items, which we know that the suppliers are less and the spend to them is really high. So it can be a very specialized machine that we are specifically buying for us. So I'll take an example of say 3D printer. I mean, although it may be readily available in the market right now, but considering the niche probabilities and the technicalities that we may require, we would have to develop long-term relationship with the supplier. We are able to show them what would be our forecast spend later down the line, so that the suppliers keep working with us, and supplier understand that that they are treated as partners, not as suppliers, or not as something that we can switch later. So here is the most requirement of maintaining the relationship. Continuous supplier relationship management is required with respect to maybe periodically, or half yearly or quarterly, where discussions have to be done on how to improve things. So this matrix is called as Craig matrix. People call it a segmentation matrix as well, and it can be derived from how you use the spend analysis and understand what is the spend, and whether you're able to see it item wise or supplier wise or category wise, and you can do the segmentation of categories, spend or supplier or material basis that, and you can understand how to proceed ahead and what becomes your priority. So similar to Craig is the supplier perception matrix. Now it is something which is an external thing, but it's a good thing to know, because and it is really helpful when it comes when we go for negotiation, or when we discuss to suppliers relationship management with suppliers in periodically. We need to understand how the supplier looks us as a customer, and whether we are somebody they look onto priority, or whether we are somebody who are just a part of business, and they can keep us on a second hand basis. So when we similarly we drive a matrix here as well, basis the value of business that we are giving, and probable account attractiveness that the supplier looks into as us on the scale. And we understand that if we have the highest value of business, and if we have the most attractiveness, for example, if us as a company can be their entry to a certain industry segment, so they can see us as a core by a core asset, and they can understand that this is something that we need to work with. They would, because if we are under the core segment, they will try to give us the best possible deals, they'll try to give us best possible attention. There would be much better response times. There are times, so for example, there are times when you work with certain ERP suppliers who know that they are the market leaders. So there are times that their responses are quite delayed. They would like to work. They'll ask to push us to work on their terms. But similarly, if there is some other supplier which is providing a certain niche activity but wants to enter into specific industry, so for example, e-commerce or automobile, so they will try to understand the client more, try to give more of the features, give more discount so that they can get the business. So there the perception matters, and if you are able to understand that perception, then that helps us a lot in the negotiation. So similarly, there are other aspects, like for example development, where the relative business is low and but the attractiveness is high. So that is what I talked about, where you have uh, in case there is some proof of concept being done or there is a trial being done, so that trial gives the ability to that supplier to enter that industry, and then they try to develop that business. They try to give more and more attention to the buyer, allow them to know their capabilities and what umbrella of services or goods they provide, so that it gives them a foot in the door and allow to become a bigger supplier with respect to that. And you really do not want to be in the nuisance part where where supplier do not gives you a lot of attention because they see that the account attractiveness is low. Maybe that you would be thinking of switching from one supplier to the another. There might be a stop on the forecasted spend or the reduction in forecasted spend. So in this kind of if you are in this kind of a perception, then the suppliers would not give you the right amount of attention, and does not allow uh, the correct discounts and features, and that will hurt. So if we fall into that kind of a matrix, then we should obviously look into alternatives when it comes to suppliers. Obviously it will depend on how the supplier market is, but if we are able to switch and we could, so our emphasis should be more to become on the core aspects if we can, so that we can get the best out of suppliers. And last is the exploitable, where we know that we have a huge amount of business, but the account attractiveness is low, because it may be the reason because we are not able to understand the supplier's offering, and we're keeping it for the compliance sake, or it may be the reason because suppliers do not want that the customer should lose the buyer, supplier should lose the customer, but they are just not trying to give their best of the features or best of these services in the down the line. So this is about the supplier perception matrix. Moving on to now, when we are able to understand what the supplier is, what our strategy would be around supplier, and when we are clear about what supplier perceives as us, then we think about the how when we do RFQs, we talk about price breakdown template. Now, this breakdown template would be quite detailed for high value projects, but it's really good habit to keep it for lower value project as well, when we need to do if not quick sourcing, but the amount of time is less, so that it gives us a easy a comparison when it comes when we go into RFQ or when we go into RFP. We're able to understand what are they breaking down or how they're building up the cost is. So I have kept very few items here. It can be more elaborative considering the if you are able to delve into the elements, but this is on a very high level where you're able to distinguish between, or where you're able to break down the cost, overall cost with respect to labor, material, hired equipment, overheads and profit. So what it does is, when, if, for example, if you're asking for a project which would be completely turnkey, and even in the case of, say, single sourcing strategy, then it will help you to, compare those labor costs with the benchmark costs. It will help you to understand what material costs can be, or roughly be estimated. So, and if there are multiple suppliers, then you can compare not the cumulative cost as well, but also the individual breakdown cost. So it helps you to even negotiate with the lowest bidder, and to understand and convey to them that they are, where they are faltering, so that there is no complacency being perceived by the lowest bidder, because there are times when supplier know that what all people are participating, what all suppliers are participating, and where their advantages lie. So for example, if you are going on an RFQ, and one of the, or the supplier knows the location or the site well for certain set of activity, the pricing would come in better. But we can also drive down costs if we know the price breakdown template properly, and we are able to understand what are the labor rate or material that they have considered, because their overheads might go down because they know the location well, so they have not taken in more of contingency percentage. But because of this, you can drive the best cost down as well. I mean, that this is just an indicative. It can be more elaborate as per your requirement. Now, I talk about SWOT analysis. So whenever we talk about SWOT analysis, we think about as it being very theoretical, and we read in more of the strategic kind of trainings that we attend to, whether we have done it in our masters or PG, or maybe in any operation research kind of subject where you have read in our colleges. But it is quite useful. It may not be an applicable tool for every project that you do, but it can be for high value projects to understand what our internal strengths and weaknesses are, and to understand what are the external opportunity threats are with respect to that project. Now, the key thing for any SWOT analysis is to understand what is the definition of end state, or what the objective we are after, what we are looking at. Are we looking at the lowest price? Are we looking at certain set of features at certain set of budget? So we need to have that definition in mind, and basis those definitions, we would fill up those four quadrants, which are strengths, weaknesses, and opportunity and threats, where SW are the internal review, resource view, where we understand what we bring into picture, and opportunity and threats are the external resource review, where we understand what the outside market brings into picture for this specific project. So I've given a very simple example what I can look at. So if any big size project or high value spend project, strengths can be the spend size, because if we know that the spend size is huge, we can try to have a good discussion with supplier, a long discussion with supplier. We can understand features, because the amount of the attractiveness of our account will allow us more of attention from suppliers, more of better responses. So that is our strength. Our partner, the best alternative to negotiated agreement should be our strength. So we should be aware of what our partner is, whether it is insourcing, whether it is moving to a certain alternative. So if we are aware that is our strength, then that would help us when we are negotiating for lowest price. Weakness would be a limited time for agreement. So usually this is the biggest pain for any sourcing and procurement professional, because we are multitaskers, but we want to be perfectionists as well, and we would like to have every information available to us, and the time to have discussions with supplier, because no decisions usually happen on the very first go, and there are repetitive parties and rounds of discussions involved. So the limited time is becomes a weakness, where we need to not just cover the pricing part, but also do the discovery part with internal and external teams. Now, weakness can be switching costs. So similarly, Batna, if we know that we are working with an incumbent supplier, we are discussing with incumbent supplier. So if switching cost is very high, or it is really tough to switch, or there are interdependencies of what the supplier is offering, is then it is a weakness when we go to, because supplier knows they would also have this kind of analysis about their organization or their proposition. When we talk about user preference, now this becomes a huge weakness when there are stakeholders who would like to stick to specific, who are so much in love with the feature of certain activity or certain proposal from the supplier that they would not like to deviate, and they would also convey their agreement in principle that this would be something which we would look after. So this reduces down the leverage. Similarly, if then we go to the external opportunities, or if we are able to see that we can aggregate demand, if we are able to see that there are opportunities to leverage future increases, if we can have a discussion with the supplier and these can become our opportunities when we are discussing with them. Threats, how the spend would affect the other project, because there can be a budget constraint, there can be how uh, I mean, if we are spending an X amount on a certain supplier, then it would not leave us really a good budget for the other suppliers or other propositions, which might be as important, not as high as the specific project in hand, but might be as important as the first one is, and can it have a cascading effect. Now, a threat can be that there can be a possible hike in maintenance and services costs over a year. So it completely is in the hand of the supplier to manage the services later down the year. And if we are not able to have discussion on that, then it can lead to a lot of issues. And a market leader can drive this. They usually drive this in their favor. Moving on to the total cost of ownership. So TCO, similar to the spend analysis, it's quite an elaborated thing. But whenever we are looking at, irrespective of size of the project, whenever we are looking at the value of the proposition, we need to understand the total cost of ownership, and it's not just for the suppliers or just for the buyers, but it is also required for us to, if we can convey this to the stakeholders, because there are times when they only see some item on the e-commerce site and they assume that this is the only price they're required to pay, and they forget about the risk associated. And there are times that I assume that a lot of buyers here would have associate professional here have witnessed in their lifetime that they would have gone to their teams or to stakeholders with certain proposition, and they would have rejected it on when they would have seen it on very first so that this is higher than what we can get on the e-commerce site as well. And what is the use of you being buyer in organization, what is the leverage that you're bringing in? So this is something which is required to be conveyed to them, that there is not just the buying cost, but there are the other aspects as well that includes into it. And I have just bifurcated the total cost of ownership into pre-acquisition costs, which we incur on whenever we are doing the RFQ market research on all the internal resources that we are utilizing. We are doing the acquisition cost where there is purchase price, taxes, warranties that we pay at the time, and the PO cost that we implement. Then there is post acquisition cost where we have repeated spend over the years where we are looking at consumables being bought. And then there is a disposal of the salvage value when there is every year there is a depreciation, or when we are trying to remove that altogether, capex item can be scrapped off, so that could get minus. So for one of the examples that come here is that there are times when we tend to buy from an intermediary rather than direct from the suppliers, and there are times when the buyers, when the stakeholders ask us that why haven't we gone direct, and we give them that the reseller was available, so they do not understand that onboarding a supplier, increasing the supply base, the amount and effort invested to discuss terms, that also constitutes to cost. And if we are avoiding that for a slight margin, and maybe we are getting an edge with the reseller because they can provide us better services because we have a huge amount of spend with them for a lot of different projects. So that kind of information has to be shared and should be calculated, or at least on an approximate basis, so that decision making processes are done really easily and quite transparently. Moving on to fallback terms. Now, this is something which I have actually derived on my own. It may be similar to it's like our job is just not just to negotiate pricing or delivery. Our job is more to understand what are the terms of purchase. And usually, any organization, or either be it buyer or be supplier, want to have the spend or the purchase on their own terms, on their own paper, because nobody wants to involve their legal and wants to go as quickly as possible. But that doesn't happen. That isn't the case, and we have to go into this big aspect of discussing terms. So I prefer to have a fallback term. So for example, if you send out your terms and conditions and those are being marked up by the suppliers, so you would have something as guidance, what tolerance, what uh, limits that you can go for. So for example, when we talk about scope of use, where are we using that application? So, for example, if it is software, where sorry, I am an IT buyer, so I would be examples would be more on software on the IT part. So, where those resources would be used, what geographies are allowed, what companies and subsidiaries can use that function. So all that has to be discussed, and if we are able to have clarity on the tolerances our companies legal can give us, rather than going every time to legal, it will serve us quite an advantage and reduce the timeline of discussion. Also, like clauses like limitation of liability, termination rights, indemnification, data protection, intellectual property. So there are times when the supplier, I mean, usually our terms, any company's terms are such that they give protection to themselves more than the opposite party. So it is a back and forth where the protection has to be shared. And if we are able to have those terms with us, obviously these would be agreed with the legal. So that will serve as a really good time saver. And it can be done either if we are able to have a legal feedback, or it can be done basis the past negotiations that you have done on terms. So you can keep a database of that, simple how those terms were negotiated. So, for example, when you do limits of liability, maybe your standard clause would be like $10 million or $20 million, but there might be a situation where the project size is so small, the supplier would like to reduce it to say one times of the project price, or 2 times the project price. So there should be some feedback or fallback guideline, whether if you are able to see that risk is low, so the 1x or the 2x of the project size is good enough as the limit of liability, and that would close that question there, and it would just require legal confirmation rather than consultation, and the redundant communication can be ruled out and reduce the time here. Okay. Last thing is, this is one of the practices that you can use. I mean, this is also something not very standard, but a good thing to do. And this is a negotiation one pager. So normally when we have discussion with supplier, it may be on telephone or face to face, or through any sort on video conferencing. If we have certain one pager with us, I mean, rather than flipping pages of papers or switching from documents, one pager which gives us information on what the project size is, what the project define is, what the internal budget is, what the forecast can be, what whether we are working on a supplier which we can switch. What is the optimistic value or reservation value? Optimistic value stands for the best possible case scenario that we are looking at, and what is the reservation value is the value which is the last that we would deem as acceptable, and beyond that we would walk away from the deal. So if we have those numbers information available at these times, then it becomes easier, because when we go, do not need to have this in an Excel format or a Word format. A paper can be useful, and it will be really helpful if you have team negotiating with you, if there are two-member team who are negotiating, so that both the members are on the same page and not an incorrect value is popped out or discussed while having discussion. So it conveys a, a, a strict or a standard answers to suppliers, and they are also able to understand that how much aware we are. When we talk about the supplier side of it, if we are aware, the or other things that we can think of is the first submission value, what they have done, what features that they have provided us. It can be services, it can be goods. What are the required features that are must haves? What are the desirable features that can be delighters, that can be additionals, and what are the extras that can be removed, that can also drive down the cost? Because at certain times when the supplier wants to enter a segment, they tend to fill these proposition with a lot of extras and more of the lighters which we might not require and might be adding to the might be adding to the overall proposition value. Then we can have key clauses, but if they have marked up and we are having a discussion on those clauses, what are the clauses that they have accepted, what are they have not accepted, on what we are looking to have mutual discussion. So we can go ahead with, we can to straightforwardly say that these are standard clauses that we like to keep as is in the document, and we do not expect any kind of deviation, and then there can be clauses. So this kind of one page of really helps. I mean, it's a good one look activity, and it will be really helpful to understand how the discussions can be done, and it helps to cover at least, if not all, major points of discussion, so that the rework is not required. So for there are times when we go with a list, I mean piles of paper, we end up forgetting the important aspect. Obviously, we will discuss about the pricing, but the features and clauses may get lost out in the discussion. So this can be a really good helpful activity. So one last thing, I mean, this is not something which is tangible in a sense that you have something written on it. But as a buyer, I understand and I assume that we need to have communication and cultural sensitivity. It is the most important thing because it is a people-centric job. We have to discuss with a lot of different people from different states of a country or different countries altogether outside, because of the global aspect of the impact that we have to see. So if we have strong communication, and it doesn't mean that it is the breadth of the vocabulary, but it conveys what you are able to, what are we trying to say as being communicated, and the right thing is being communicated. While negotiation, we need to have active listening. We have to be aware of what the supplier is proposing when we are having discussion, even with the stakeholders as well. We can mark up possible compliance issues, possible flags. We can have discussion with stakeholders internally and externally, that what are the expectations that needs to be done beforehand going ahead with any proposals. Cultural sensitivity part, I've mentioned it as a bit more, because there are times when we forget about that. And if we are able to do small bits, I mean, it's not about learning anybody's language, but if we are able to greet any person in their own local language, then helps to build more rapport and trust and credibility. It shows an effort to welcome a person with openness, and this being a people-centric job, as I said, helps to create an atmosphere where discussion and communication can be done. A small talk about, not just about weather, but more about what has happened. If you're aware of what the generic news is, or not political or religious, but about sports or maybe, then it really helps to initiate discussion and builds rapport. And it helps further down the line when we are able to convey things, I mean, with internally and externally. So this was my presentation on the tools that I think are helpful. As I said at the start of the presentation, these tools are indicative, not exhaustive. This is not the complete, or this is not the world is infinite. They can, and what, as we say, there is a saying in a quite popular TV show, that what we know is a drop, and what we don't know is an ocean. So this is mere some drops maybe. but this is not exhaustive, and you can have your own derivatives of this. These are standard tools, and you can derive it and draw your own application with respect to what your objective is. And my prerogative was to convey these tools because for a new person in the domain, it helps and to draw a structured methodology whenever we are, because rather than learning from continuous mistakes, it's better to adopt a methodology and drive efficiency. So this concludes my presentation, and I hope that this was helpful, and it, if not, gave you something new to learn. It would have revised, or it would have refreshed some of the concepts or the things that you could be utilized. Thank you.